Welcome, everyone. Could not be happier to see you, albeit virtually. We miss seeing everybody in person, but this is a great silver lining that we've had since the pandemic started with parent education. We're able to bring to you today somebody like Dr. Donald Grant, who's actually in Southern California. This is much easier to just log onto the computer than to fly him up here as much as we would like to, and we promise Donald we will. But again, my name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of the Parent Education Series, a program that is now in its 15th year, and co-founder of the new nonprofit, the Parent Venture. My partner, Bev Hartman, co-founder, is also with us today. She will be running the chat. So please do use the chat. If you want to look for resources, talk to us, talk to one another. I also want to say we have simultaneous Spanish interpretation available today. So if you would like Spanish or need Spanish, please do look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see a globe button that says interpretation. Click the globe and then click Spanish, and our interpreter, Cynthia Hinestrosa, will help you, okay? So I don't think that this could be a more important or timely topic. I think the events of the week speak for how important it is for us to have courageous conversations with our children and teens about race and systemic racism in America. So Dr. Grant is going to give us some historical perspective and then share his insights into how we can move the needle in talking with our children about these important issues. I want to start again by thanking our sponsors, the Redwood City School District, the Sequoia Healthcare District, the Sequoia Union High School District, and the Parent Venture, without whose support this would not be possible. Those of you who are PTA or PTSA members, please do join these school-based organizations as they help with our funding for these events. Dr. Grant is going to talk to you for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open the conversation up to you, the audience. So if you would, if you have questions during the event, please feel free to put them in the Q&A button. That is question and answer rather than the chat. And we'd like to get to as many questions as possible. So do keep your comments kind of short and as generalized as you can. That is, if you have a very detailed question about your child, see if you can turn it into something that would benefit the most people to hear from Dr. Grant about, okay? So questions in the Q&A. In the chat, Bev will be putting resources and links to things that Dr. Grant mentions today, as well as a very short survey that we hope you will take at the end, 2 minutes. We use it, we read it, we promise we read everyone, and it helps us plan for future events. All right, so Q&A chat, we've covered all the logistics. Let me tell you a little bit about today's keynote speaker, Dr. Donald Grant. He began his career as a middle school science teacher in Baltimore, Maryland, after graduating from Hampton University with a bachelor's degree in biology. He holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and serves in 2 executive director roles, one with his training and consulting firm, Mindful Training Solutions, and the other at the Center for Community and Social Impact for Pacific Oaks College. Dr. Grant is a national thought leader in the areas of race and systemic racism, a social cultural analyst, mental health and mindfulness expert, educator, and social services advocate. He is also an international speaker and workshop facilitator, film and TV consultant, and a published author. His latest book, Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, was published in 2019. Please join me in a really warm welcome for our today's speaker, Donald Grant. Take it away, Donald.
Well, everyone, so glad to be with you all. I was just throwing some of the books to the panelists, so when I start talking about them, they can just copy and paste in the chat box so there is to see them and that people have such a high degree of interest in advancing this work is really, really important and really critical. As Charlene said, we're going to kind of dive in a few different ways today to really have an enriching conversation about structural racism and what that looks like in our schools and what we need to do about it. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you all get an opportunity to see that. Let's see, here we go. All right. didn't say this before, but today I think I'm going to cut a little bit short from some of my slides and we'll get everybody to get the deck. But there's a 3 or 4 minute video that I think would be valuable for this group that I want to share. And so, if that's okay with you, when we end the session, when we get towards the end, I'm going to pivot to a short video that I think will be very valuable. All right. And so, as Charlene stated, I have practiced as a clinical psychologist, as a middle school science teacher, and worked as a clinician across LA County, Department of Mental Health specifically. And currently, I am at Pacific Oaks College. Many of you may know Pacific Oaks College as being a true thought leader in the space of early childhood education, and specifically non-bias, anti-bias work. And so, my business is called Mindful Training Solutions, and I start everything I do off kind of with this expectation or this ask that you all kind of practice a little mindfulness as we move through the slides in the presentation today, simply because the magnitude, not just of what's happening in the world right now, but the magnitude of these discussions tend to bring about feelings and emotions that people don't always pay as close attention to as they could. And it really sometimes stops the progress. And so I'm hoping that you guys will pay attention to what you're experiencing and not judge it and allow it to be, so that you can focus on the changes that you need to make. We're going to dive right in and look at this kind of cycle of systemic oppression. And my goal as we move through this presentation is that you all are able to tie in the understanding of different types of oppression. We're talking specifically about racism today, but we understand that these systems work in many different ways. And so, how the cycle works is it oftentimes begins or is identified or observed inside this space of systematic mistreatment of the target group. And whether we're talking about women or the LGBTQIA plus community or Black and Brown folk, we see this mistreatment and then we begin to justify it through different ways. Oftentimes, that justification is kind of created based on the effects of being oppressed. So when we talk about poor communities or under-resourced communities and we talk about classism, we oftentimes blame some of the results of our classist system on the individuals who are being impacted by under-resourced communities. And so if you're a teacher and you have a thought and you say, these poor people just don't really care about education. They don't show up for parent-teacher conferences. They're not engaged and involved in the school. And that's because these parents may be working 2 or 3 jobs and can't get in at the time frame where it's being offered. And as a result, we say, oh, we're just not going to engage them. We're just not going to have the teacher-parent conferences because they don't show up. And so we justify that mistreatment. And then as institutions perpetuate them, we see it exacerbate, meaning that now none of these parents are showing up because we're not taking time to say, maybe we need to have a 7 p.m. parent teacher conference for those who are impacted in this way. And then there's this internalized dominance that comes as a result of this, where we think that those of us who have financial resources, oh, we're better than them because they don't ascribe to the things that we ascribe to. And then the oppressed groups begin to internalize that. Due to sexism, you have women who will say, oh, I would never have a female lawyer. I'll never have a female doctor, because they've absorbed the oppressive system's messages about their lack of efficacy in those areas. Finally, society accepts it. And when we talk about sexism and we look at the number of women who are CEOs of any Fortune 500 companies, we know that society has accepted it and promoted it and made us believe through misinformation that this is true. So this is the cycle of systemic oppression that we'll talk about. And I always lead off with this example here because many of us are very familiar with Felicity Huffman and the college admission scandal, but few of us are able to have seen the Tanya McDowell case, where she was actually sentenced to 5 years in jail for placing the wrong address, lying for the address of hers. She was homeless, but lying on the application so that her son can get into a kindergarten that would prepare him adequately for the future. Um, and we see the disparity here. This is an example of how systemic racism, structural classism works. And when we see the intersection here of race and socioeconomic status, we see these very different outcomes. And it's important to note that we do that. And so we're going to look at some common language, because what we always want to do is make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the nuances associated with these different definitions. And so, for instance, a stereotype is this internal thought that we have about a thing. It could be a person, it could be an object, and we're going to talk a little bit about how those are formed through this thing called heuristics, and we'll talk about that. So these stereotypes that we have based on whether it's personal experience, limited as it may be, information from history, film, TV, all sorts of things, leads to prejudices where we behave, where we think in ways that are supportive of certain thoughts and not supportive of other thoughts, and we create this feeling surrounding it, and that prejudice that we have informs our behaviors, and those behaviors, when we act on them, are called discrimination. When we act on our prejudicial behaviors, now when we drop discrimination into a bucket or a system of power, it becomes the ism, whether that's sexism, classism, heterosexism, whatever it may be. It's dropped into a system of power, and that discrimination then becomes the ism. Unconscious bias is a buzzword that many of us are familiar with, and a lot of people are requesting unconscious bias training. And what that means is it's addressing these things that sit under the surface that we don't know that we're operating from, but they're there. And we all hold unconscious biases, and depending on what our role is in the world, it really dictates the impact of these biases and what they look like. So, for instance, if my barista at Starbucks had an unconscious bias against Black men, it's less dangerous, although very injurious. It's less dangerous than if a teacher had that or if a police officer had that. And so we'll talk more about how these things work. And so here's the first example, heuristics. Here you see a slide with doorknobs or door exit devices. All of us have created this box, this heuristic for door exit devices, such that when we walk up to one that doesn't look like one in our homes, we don't have to think, I'd really like to get out of this room, but I just don't know how. You manipulate the door exit device and you leave the room because you have a box that's created for it. Door exit devices are really easy to talk about because they don't have feelings, they don't need jobs, they're not socialized into any sort of cultural context, but we know that people are. And when we talk about these shortcuts, the way that our neurological systems work, we use them for everything. The challenge is that the outcomes for these heuristics oftentimes create this dissonance that is just so unbearable that it creates an opportunity for us to either promote change or to maintain the status quo. And so cognitive dissonance is the mental conflict that occurs when beliefs are contradicted by new information. And human beings work in ways such that the outcome of cognitive dissonance is tension. And that's the tension between the two competing thoughts. That tension is only broken when we either change the truth or change our behaviors. And so, as we get into this conversation about race, it's really important to give this example here that when we talk about the times of enslavement in America, we understand that the Black enslaved people were identified as property. And you'll notice how I continuously say enslaved people as opposed to slaves. The term slaves tends to continuously objectify the group to make them seem less than human, which is a part of this dissonance process, right? Enslaved people brings about a different context that's important to note. And to that point, during the times when the institution of slavery was legal in the United States, Black people were identified as property. That was a direct result of this theory of cognitive dissonance, even though it may not have been named or known at that time. What we found was that in order to treat the enslaved people as they were treated, in order to take a leather whip to someone's back until it was burst open, bleeding, you couldn't consider yourself a kind, caring, loving human being and perpetrate that particular type of violence to another individual who you saw as a kind, caring, loving human being. And so, in order to break the dissonance of, I got to do all this bad stuff to this person, they would either change the truth or change the behavior. As we know, the behavior stuck. But the truth that was changed was that these people are not people. In fact, it was written into the Constitution that we were three-fifths of a person. And that allowed the tension associated with cognitive dissonance to dissipate. And as such, we maintain this perspective over centuries in order to promote this. So when we talk about anti-black and brown racism as a business model, it's important to understand that there are nationwide benefits to the maintenance of this sort of oppression, and it's existed throughout history. We don't always talk about it, and it's important to note the reasons why we don't. And so here are a few concepts that share with us why it is or how it is, excuse me, that many of these tropes have been maintained. So the first part is historical revisionism and negationism. And here you see a colonized story and a decolonized story all in the same page about Christopher Columbus. And it speaks to these concepts of revisionism and negationism. And it's literally taking history, reformatting it or eliminating certain things such that it tells the story to maintain a national narrative. And that national narrative speaks to maintaining this hierarchy that keeps white men specifically at the height. When we talk about negationism and revisionism, here are ways in which it plays out on the other side. This textbook was published, and it was published in Texas for Texas schools, and it was about Mexican American heritage. It was identified that it had 68 factual errors, 42 interpretive errors, 31 omission errors, multiple references to Mexicans as lazy compared to European or American workers, and Mexican Americans, Chicanos, adopted a revolutionary narrative that opposed Western civilization and wanted to destroy the US society. I was no Chicano studies major, but what I do know about that group is that their evidence demonstrates that their goal was to have a voice and integrate their particular needs appropriately into a society that wasn't allowing it to be integrated. Another level of historical revisionism and negationism is this particular book that identified enslaved people as workers as a part of the immigration pattern section in the global studies practice. Again, as we minimize this and call these individuals workers, we take the onus away of the history that relegated this group to a severe trauma, and we reframe it in order to maintain or to not activate, if you will, white fragility. Now, I know some of you are having feelings right now as we move through this conceptual framework, as you think about how this works and what this looks like. It's interesting for you to pay attention to your experience. This teacher asked eighth grade students to list the positive and negative aspects of enslavement, and it's used from from this textbook that identified that not all slaves were unhappy, that not all people who were enslaved were unhappy. Now, in my son's school, a few years ago, we removed a textbook, not a textbook, but a book from a classroom because it was identifying or indicating something that we knew could be dangerous. This is an assignment where an individual teacher, again, based on that previous textbook, asked students to create a balanced view of the life of this enslaved person. There can be no other explanation for an assignment like this besides to minimize the guilt associated with our participation in the institution of slavery. The book that we removed from my son's class was one of the Who I Am series that some of you may be familiar with. This was years ago. And it wasn't from my son's class. It was from a classroom. There was a passage in the book, and this was the Harriet Tubman book, a passage that said Harriet Tubman had a happy life until she became a teenager. What we know is that when we talk about anti-bias programming and anti-bias education, it is critical for us to pay attention to these small nuances, these little wrinkles that are aimed at colonized versions of these stories. Now, is it possible that Harriet Tubman had a laugh in adolescence or in childhood? Absolutely. But to make a statement that someone who was owned by someone else was happy up until a certain point during that ownership is not appropriate. And so when we talk about what we need to do to have anti-bias programming in our schools and in our classes, it's about paying attention to these approaches of understanding difference. And part of that is digging our heels in and understanding the history of difference on our land, because we need to build more comfort to talk amongst ourselves so that we can be better for our students and be better partners for our teachers. And so their value is to respect the civil society and to actively challenge bias, stereotyping, and all forms of discrimination in schools and communities. It incorporates inclusive curriculum that reflects diverse experiences and perspectives, instructional methods that advance student learning, and strategies to create and to create and sustain safe, inclusive, and respectful learning communities. One of the premier leaders in this space is Louise Derman Sparks, and she actually did a lot of her original work at Pacific Oaks College where I work. And so, what I want to do here, we're going to follow up. We're going to look at these after we go through some more context, depending on if we get to see the video or not. And what I want you to know is that we'll revisit these again after we move through, because a part of what I'd love for our second part of our discussion to be is how do we adequately introduce these four important goals of anti-bias education into our schools to make sure that all of our students feel seen, heard, and valued. And so one of the first things we have to do is understand that children begin to learn about race way earlier than we think. This book right here, the first R, How Children Learn Race and Racism, really speak to some of the concerns that we get when parents say, oh, my child is only 5 years old. We can't start this conversation. It's too soon. Well, research begs to differ. And it demonstrates that children begin to make decisions about race and begin to make decisions based on race as early as 3 and 4 years old. When we talk about some of the reasons why that is, it's because we have already created a system or a foundation where these men and men like them have been honored and given the historical relevance of being the founders of the American education system. What we know is that these men studied in Northern Africa, in Egypt, and other places, and took that knowledge with them and claimed it as their own. This is one of the first components that have been utilized to maintain to maintain an underclass in the system of education. When I think about me growing up in a housing project in Buffalo, New York, and I was bussed out to a magnet honor school outside of my community, I come home and people would say, "You talk white." I always make the joke, it's actually you speak white. But what that did was it provided a message that said that academia, or at the very least, the proper command of the King's English, is somehow disassociated with your race, with your culture. And if we don't know early on that this is a part of the structural plan to maintain oppression, we're not doing our jobs. We're not understanding the extra effort that must go into dismantling this system to pay attention to the future. Religion has also been used as a tool of oppression. As you travel the coast, you see all of these missions that were used to hurt and harm indigenous Mexican and other indigenous people on this land. We see this Bible that was restructured and recreated in order to tell a story to enslaved people about how awful they were and how they needed to be maintained inside oppression in order to do that. These three books right here provide some additional context to what I was referencing. The Rescue of Jerusalem. I didn't dig into that story, but it's a great story on how African king actually saved the proliferation of the three major world religions when King Taharka came over and saved King Hezekiah and the walls of Jerusalem from the Assyrians. Stolen Legacy talks about the Greek and Roman philosophers coming to Africa to study, and then they came before Columbus speaks to the existence of people of African descent on this land prior to our enslavement. When we look at forced assimilation, these are some of the dangers that we face. And one of the goals here is to help us understand that when we see these images, these are all indigenous people before colonization and after colonization. We're still doing this inside of our classrooms where we're framing all of our work from a very Eurocentric frame that dominates the spirit of people of color and people who don't exist inside those norms. You can see here the hard work that went early on to really deny these people of their traditions, their customs, their language. And what we see right now is that was the case in some ways when we look at the European immigrants, except it happened a little bit differently. I always ask this question: how did European immigrants become white? It's actually the topic of my next book, looking at when individuals arrived from Germany, they were German immigrants. They weren't white. These individuals were Italian, Greek, Swedish. Individuals who currently identify as white created an identity as a result of oppression. When descendants of the colonists began to say, you know what, Mr. Italian immigrant, if you stop cooking all that pungent food, I'll let you buy a house on my street. The Italian immigrants began to throw away bits of their culture to become white. When the descendants of the colonists said, you know what, Mr. Polish man, if you change your last name, if you just take that SKI off of your last name, I'll let you enroll your kid in my school. When we talk about why that was happening, it was because the descendants of the colonists began to see a connection building between the immigrants and the Black people who had been recently freed from enslavement. This was all in the late 1860s and 1870s. In order to dismantle that union, the hierarchy had to be created. And white identity, as we know it, was built on that particular framework. James Baldwin said, if, for example, one managed to change the curriculum in all the schools so that Negroes learn more about themselves and their real contributions to this culture, you would be liberating not only Negroes, you'd be liberating white people who know nothing about their own history. And the reason is that if you are compelled to lie about one aspect of anybody's history, you must lie about it all. If you have to lie about my role here, if you have to pretend that I hold all that cotton just because I love you, then you have done something to yourself. Blockbuster, I use as an analogy because it's no longer open. And at one point in time, somebody came to Blockbuster executives and said, you're going to be able to watch any movie from your living room in a few years. You need to get on board. Blockbuster said, nah, that's not going to happen. And as a result, Blockbuster no longer exists. What I do want you to understand is that the American system and the international system did in fact have a business continuity model for Black and brown people. It did in fact understand that by 1860, America was exporting over 80% of the world's cotton. and emancipation was on the brink. They knew that this global economy was going to be disrupted in a way that it had not been before. So what did they do? They came up with ways to maintain the systematic oppression of the formerly enslaved people through things like convict leasing, debt peonage, and the current prison industrial complex. Lynching was used as a severe way to do this. And what we find is that anti-lynching laws have still been being litigated up until last year. Lynching on the West Coast was also used as a tool to maintain this oppression for indigenous and brown men, Mexican men specifically. One of the things I want to end on as we begin to move into the discussion is looking at these images, many of us fail to realize that there's a trauma associated with the children who were in these pictures. What would happen would be that a neighbor would say, "Hey, Johnny, come on down, get your kids, grab a drink, grab a sandwich. We're going to hunt down a Black person, hang him from a tree, and set him on fire. Bring your kids." The little girl in this picture is the age of a college student's grandmother right now. The work we have to do is so significant depending on where you sit and how you desire to create change. We are, in fact, living in two types of America. And depending on what you see on your regular profile through this world, it will dictate what you attend to. This ambiguous picture here, I'm going to give you guys a second to look at it, but some of you see one person and some of you see another person. That's perspective. Here you see an older woman, here you see a younger woman. Depending on your experiences, you may not have seen either one, or you may have seen both. What I'm asking is that you pay attention to how these systems work, and we'll end with this example to open up discussion. When we talk about systemic racism, excuse me, it's important to add a reference of understanding so that you can see how it lives over time. This particular Servicemen Readjustment Act, oftentimes known as the GI Bill, was a opportunity where the US spent $95 billion to support 16 million people returning from war. It provided job training, college tuition, home loans, small business support, and actually fueled the development of the modern middle class. What we know is that all men returning from war were not able to access these dollars. So let's talk about what that looks like. Philip, born white dude, white dad, cute suspenders there, lived in Philadelphia. Oh man, had I realized that I left Philadelphia on this slide, Philadelphia is kind of triggering today, so maybe I should have changed it to Oahu or something. Anyways, his father was poor, high school education, came back from the army, got a home loan due to the GI Bill, was able to send Philip to school based on that home equity. Philip graduates, get a professional job, buys a home. He inherits his father's home after his father dies, completes college debt free. Here we have Ray. Ray, on the other hand, all other things being equal, except he and his dad were Black. His dad was not able to access this home loan due to restrictive underwriting and remained in segregated communities. His family could not afford to send him to college. He remains living in his neighborhood community, rental property, so on and so forth. And he has to even borrow money to bury his father after his father passes away. When we fast forward through this, we see what Philip is able to give his children. This is referred to as 3 generations of accumulated advantage. The flip side of that is 3 generations of accumulated disadvantage. And it's important that we understand this as a system of structural racism when we get references to people saying, well, I wasn't living in 1850. What does this have to do with anything? These things have built upon one another year over year over year. Oppression is grounded in trauma, and we want you guys to be allies to fight against this. We first learned about this when we saw the survivors of Jewish Holocaust, of the children of Jewish Holocaust survivors coming to therapy in the 1960s. And that's when we knew that trauma, race-based trauma, lived across generations. So just because there are no people alive right now who experience enslavement, it's still impacting us in the same way that those who are historically connected to the Jewish Holocaust may experience that. Today's trauma is tomorrow's historical trauma. What's happening at the border right now is going to be hugely impactful on the next stage of our Latinx populations. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now. There were a few things that I'll make sure just to incorporate through the discussion that we won't have to share on this slide. And so, Charlene, I know we only have about 25 minutes left for our discussion. I'm going to skip the video, and what I'll do is I'll talk about the video, and then I'll make sure the link is inside the chat box so that you all can access it a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Donald. That was an amazing discussion.
Thank
Really
you.
incredible discussion. Yep. Yep. We've been getting comments from those of you who are attending and watching saying thank you. That was incredible. Everybody who signed on is still with us. You've shown us a lot. You've empowered a lot today. So thank you.
Thank you.
And yes, for those of you who may be new to this program, I always send out a follow-up email with links and resources. So you'll be hearing more about Dr. Grant, and we will include the link to that video so that you can watch it. Let me start out by saying, Donald, I understand that you work with Pacific Oaks College and that they have a long-standing anti-bias curriculum that was adopted many years ago. What can you tell us about when we should begin talking with our children explicitly about race and racism?
Immediately. Understanding understanding that talking about race is different than talking about racism. And many of us have not done our own due diligence to have the internal conversations with ourselves about how we feel about racism. What I know, again, it says it right here, kids start to act on it as early as age 3. And so even if we're not articulating discussions about racism, we want to begin laying a foundation for our children where we are actually teaching them about race and racism, even if we don't articulate it directly. And so I can't find the Ezra Keats book either, Charlene, and I'm so mad about it.
I'm gonna have to send you one.
Oh, I have them here somewhere. But we talk about the Ezra Keats books very often, and we talk about how they exist in a framework where they're just showing Black children doing regular things, just playing in the snow, going to the library, having videos of Latinx kids just doing regular things, and looking at how we're able to create a heterogeneous environment, even if we live or exist inside of a very homogeneous environment. And so when we talk about talking about race, we want to first of all make sure that all of our children know that children who look all different ways are equally as human as they are, equally as interested in regular stuff as they are. You don't want every single book on your child's bookshelf or in your child's classroom where they're Black and brown kids as protagonists to be always fighting social justice. Those are important, but what you don't want is to create a framework where the identity of my son is only grounded in his fight for equity. You want to see my son as that kid who's just going to the library like your kid. And so integrating those things, I think, is a good first step in making sure you create this solid grounding of equity.
So again, today's presentation is sponsored by the Redwood City School District, which is a very diverse school district. But parents have been asking, what do you do if you don't live in a diverse community? How can you expose your kids, help them meet friends who are Black and brown? What you gave us some advice yesterday. I mean, I hope you'll share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many ways to do it. Here's the problem, though, Charlene. They're not always convenient. And that's the first thing that people have to recognize is that doing the work of inclusion is not always easy and it's not always convenient. So, what that means is you may have to find a karate class or a dance class that's outside of your direct community, and engage in that with people who look different. Go to join a soccer league that may not be directly in your neighborhood. If you, as a parent, are truly dedicated, again, I get it. I have a sixth grader and we live in a very monolithic community. There are more diversity at the school now, but when we began, we were one of the only monoracial Black families at my son's school. And so we, as a Black family, had to work hard to even make sure that our son was surrounded by other Black people who weren't his family members. And so, if that means, again, traveling an extra 7 miles to go, and I get this is California. I know an extra 7 miles is not just an extra 5 or 10 minutes. I get that could be 30 minutes. Um, but if you're dedicated to it, you'll do it. And it
Well,
doesn't have to be
yeah,
every single cycle, right? And so let's say you once a year during a 3 month period where your kid is taking a karate class in another neighborhood. You don't have to do it the whole year round because that makes it daunting.
yeah. So a couple of related questions. Such a good point. Really, parents are very interested. Here's a viewer who says, "Wow, that was incredible. I learned a lot. Thank you." For Asian American families, is there anything else that you can add to the conversation?
100%. Two things. Have my daughter, they call us enemy. My son because it talks about the internment camps. And George Takai does a wonderful job at kind of narrating this book. And again, it's a graphic novel, and so it's wonderful. One of the things that I found is that Asian American families oftentimes find themselves disconnected in a way. And what we know to be true is that the model minority stereotype about Asian Americans is, and people don't always know this, it's actually a tool of white supremacy to maintain distance between certain groups of Black and Brown people. And that the Asian American model minority trope is being used consistently to create this hierarchy that we want to break. And so when we're talking about Asian American families, I brought this George Takai book specifically to talk about how we can access a space and time where we can kind of make sure that everybody is joining on into this social justice framework. Because what white America has convinced Asian Americans of is that they are not in danger of experiencing the same racism that Black and other brown people do. And the fact of the matter is that they are, and they do. As soon as Asian American communities begin to advocate for themselves and move outside of the space that white supremacy has created for them, they too begin to experience that strangling hold of white supremacy. And so I think that by building these bridges between all of our historical struggles, and Asian Americans being very honest with themselves about them being racism adjacent, that it's really important. I think that's really valuable.
So everybody, pardon me, everybody loves your library, Donald. A parent just asked, do you have a book to recommend for Latino families?
Absolutely. And in fact, I don't know if I brought that one out, but there's this book called Con Respecto, and it's a book not for children, but it's a really, really great book. And I have it here somewhere. Excuse my back. Con Respecto talks about this concept in the Latinx community about how we don't always honor some of the needs that we see there. And the idea is that we want to pay attention to our Latinx community as not a monolith in the way that we currently do, but as a very diverse community. And con respecto, I wish I would have grabbed that one out too.
That's
Con
okay.
respecto,
We'll let you, we'll add it
yeah,
to the
hopefully you
follow-up.
guys can find it. Con Respecto goes into this conversation about saying, how do we pay attention to the socio-emotional needs of this community by juxtaposing, what happens with them, and our next steps, and actually planning and being deliberate. One of the things that we miss with the Latinx population is that we're oftentimes so focused on language needs that we oftentimes forget about the other nuances associated with how they are treated. I also put this book down, The Other Slavery, that does in fact go into some of these conversations about different indigenous people and native people that have been connected to enslavement out on this side of the world. And it's a really, really, really interesting book that goes into the slavery of Indian and First Nations people, in addition to some of our indigenous Latinx communities here. So this is another good one. I haven't read this one completely, but I've thumbed through it since I picked it up recently. And so again, when we look at, let's just call a thing what a thing is really quickly. When we talk about racism, racism is violence perpetuated from white people to people of color. And we just have to, we can't sugarcoat that, right? And so what we need to do is help people of color understand, and white people understand, in order to unpack and unlearn and dismantle these systems. We have to be very transparent with accountability. We have to help our Asian American brothers and sisters know that there is a history of trauma and oppression against them, no matter how they kind of recreate the model minority status, and that it's not just about these other groups, that other people, like we said, Native Americans and other indigenous people, due to white supremacy. And until we're able to act with that and be authentic about it, we're never going to see all of our blind spots. We're never going to know that we're doing things in the classroom that harm certain children because we're not naming it properly.
Boy, that really is true. One of our viewers commented on, calling the pandemic the China virus is such a,
Yep, that's exactly it.
yeah.
That's an exact example.
Yeah. So I have one more question, and then I'm going to give you my final question that I know you like to answer. Couple of people are asking about teachers and the role of the schools. So here's the question. How do you recommend that parents best get involved to promote anti-racist curriculum, that school teacher parent connection? Comments?
We want to be supportive of our teachers. We want to give them tools, but I think it oftentimes, it depends on where your skill set is as a parent, right? So I'm going to separate this into three different groups, right? So we have some parents that we want to go to the school board. Right now, this is no longer just a classroom issue. We have the government, we have the federal government threatening to sue school districts for using the 1619 project as curriculum. So we have to pay attention to this as a systemic thing and not just a classroom thing, right? So for those parents who feel like their lane is more of an administrative, executive lane, we need you talking to school districts, helping school districts understand the importance of anti-bias implementation in order to really advance the work of the school district. And you have to make the business case for it. You have to say and explain to them and dig into the research that demonstrates that when you have a more diverse teaching force, when you do targeted recruitment to get teachers of color in there, when you do certain book placements and things like that, it raises the tide for all people, right? And then that's the school district level. Then you want to go to administrative level at your school. Those parents who find that that is their lane, you want to work with the principal and vice principal on identifying ways that you prepare the workforce to engage in this. Like, what do they need for their teachers to be on board with this implementation? And then another group of parents are going to be working directly with teachers. How can I be supportive in bringing books, resources, videos to all of us so that we can grow? And then the last, I said three, but there are four groups. The last thing we need to do are parent to parent. We need to help parents who are resistant to engaging in this work begin to engage. And so for parents looking to do something, I'll say those 4 points of entry are critical. Who's working with the school district administration? Who's working with the school site administration, who's supporting the teachers, and who's supporting your fellow parents to get everybody on board. Those are the types of approaches that create sustainable change.
Thank you. Parents, I hope you heard that one. We're going to summarize that. So important. It means there's an entry point for everybody to help with this problem. Everybody can have a part in it. English speaking, Spanish
Absolutely.
speaking, Chinese speaking,
And
whoever.
Charlene,
Yeah.
it's not discipline specific either. I just wanted to say that, like, I was working with the school not long ago, and they said, well, I'm a science teacher. I can't do diversity work in science. And we were talking specifically about the LGBTQIA plus community for this conversation. And they said, well, how can I talk about, transgenderism to fourth graders in science? And I said, well, actually, because I have a degree in biology. And so I was so happy with her question. I said, actually, there's so many organisms that actually change gender throughout their lifetime. I said, you got horsefish, seahorses. You have seahorses. You have all these different organisms that oscillate between gender. How wonderful would it be if you did a lesson on seahorses to open up dialogue about inclusion for our transgender community?
That is a great example. As the mother of a child who studied human biology and now does design, I'm with you. All right, this question here, we're going to have you solve all the problems of the world, and then I promise we'll finish. We want to be very respectful of your time and our attendees' time. Question. We came to America 40 plus years ago and learned that it is a melting pot. Moving forward after this election, assuming we can get done with this election, what do we need to do as Americans to heal?
That's a great question. I skipped over the slide that looked at the melting pot, but Charlene, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to pull up my deck really quickly just to have that slide up while I answer this question.
Sure. And another parent asked if you would give your nice quick definition of racism, Donald.
Yes, I will. And so this is the slide that looks at the different models of coexistence that we've had. I gave you guys the example of the forced assimilation that we had with our Native American and First Nations people. We moved to segregation, and then we did move to this melting pot model. The problem with the melting pot model, though, is that we've dumped everything into the pot like fondue, and we want it to all be the same and all look the same. The problem with that is that I need people to know that I'm different, because when I respond to being treated differently, people look at me like I'm crazy, like, oh, Donald, you don't get any different treatment when you walk into Nordstrom than I do. And I'm like, actually, I do. And it's because you're colorblind that you can't conceptualize that I might have a different experience. And so the goal is no longer the melting pot. The goal is multiculturalism that we see right here. And I always give the example that multiculturalism is like a salad. I know people don't love Olive Garden, but my son loves it. And so it's always a good, inexpensive meal for us. And Olive Garden salad is amazing to me. I love it. But when you look at the olives, the onions, the tomatoes, the lettuce, you can all see them individually for what they are and what they contribute to that salad as a whole. And so when you ask what we're going to do when we move on, if we can ever get past this week, when we move on, the goal is, in fact, for us to figure out how to honor our country as a salad, how to honor the fact that the tomato, the onion, and the olive all have equal value and all are equally as important in creating this one entity.
I think we need to make t-shirts that say, honor our country as a salad. I really like that. So Donald, final question. This is courtesy of my friend Becky Beacom from Palo Alto Medical Foundation. You know the question. What gives you hope for the future?
I love it. I'm going to answer both questions with the definition of racism and what gives me hope for the future, Charlene. When we talk about the definition of racism and all the other isms as I described before, we talk about a system of power in which they exist. What I know is that I have been able to do many of the things that I've been able to do because I've been able to dismantle certain pieces that exist against me, right? And so I sit in front of you as Dr. Grant, and having those letters by my name helps me to kind of cut through some corners of racism. But that doesn't mean that I can have Dr. Grant on my forehead when I go jogging in the evening. I'm still just a 200-pound Black man running through the streets, right? And so what gives me hope is that people are actually defining and naming and addressing these things now, to understand that when I talk to my son about, he's only 11 now, but when he's 12 and 13 and he's hanging out with his buddies, and, I say, when you go to the store, you have to get a receipt. If you guys are just hanging out and you're at 7-Eleven, I need you to always get a receipt, because you're going to be the first one accused of shoplifting amongst your group of white friends. And when we talk about hope for the future, the fathers and mothers who we're friends with, who my son is friends with, they're receptive to this conversation. They're receptive to understanding that my son will not be received in the same way that their children will be received in. And they are teaching their children to be upstanders. They're teaching their children to understand that these things happen in the same way we're teaching our children to not stand by when somebody makes a gay joke in the locker room for them to say, dude, that's not okay. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. Kids were not being given the tools. And again, this is the fourth goal of anti-bias education. How do you give tools to kids to stand up? And Louise Derman Sparks says this specifically, to stand up when they're with someone or when they're alone, to fight against intolerism, intolerant, racism, classism, sexism. And that's what gives me hope, is that now I have a cohort of youth who are to fight against oppression.
I think that is it, Donald. That just gave me chills. So we cannot thank you enough for your insight and brilliance and kindness today, for being with us. I think you've raised a lot of consciousness. You brought us all together to the table, plus you solved all the problems of the world. So a huge thank you. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. This video will be produced courtesy of our friends at the Boys and Girls Club. We have a wonderful media team of students led by Jacob Krause. So again, the video will be available in a few days.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful partnership, Charlene. What a great way to empower some young people.
Yeah, and they usually come to the performing arts centers, but today we have them in, now they're doing the back end production, but it is a great partnership. So big plug for Boys and Girls Club. Thank you, Dr. Donald Grant, for all of your wisdom today. And we hope we see everybody again soon. Take care. Happy Friday and stay well.
A pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you so much.